The road to Pity Harbor died before it reached the sea. It dissolved from cracked asphalt into a muddy track, swallowed by a perpetual fog that smelled of salt and decay. Dr. Ben Carter gripped the wheel of his sedan, the tires spinning in the muck. This was it. His penance, his 2-year assignment for the Public Health Service, a posting no one else wanted. Pity Harbor, a fishing village so isolated it was a footnote on most maps. He finally coaxed the car onto a patch of gravel next to a small, weathered building with a faded sign that read Pity Harbor Clinic. He got out. The air was thick enough to chew. It coated his lungs with a damp chill. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the mournful cry of a distant gull and the soft, constant shushing of unseen waves. The village itself was a handful of salt-bleached houses huddled around a small stone and timber jetty. The boats tied there were old, their paint peeling, their nets mended 100 times over. He noticed the first strange thing almost immediately. There were women everywhere, women on their porches mending nets, women walking along the muddy path carrying baskets. But there were very few men. The ones he did see were either old, their faces carved into deep lines by sun and sea, or they were young boys, not yet men. There was a void in the demographic, a missing generation of fathers and husbands. An old man detached himself from the shadows of a fish processing shed. He was tall and gaunt, his skin the texture of old leather. His eyes were sunk deep in their sockets, 2 chips of dark polished jet. "You the new doctor?" His voice was a low rumble, like stones grinding together underwater. "Dr. Carter, Ben," Ben said, extending a hand. The old man ignored it. "I'm Silas. We don't get many visitors." He looked Ben up and down, a slow, appraising gaze. "The sea provides, and the sea takes away. You'll learn that here." The words hung in the air, not a welcome, but a statement of fact. A creed. The clinic was worse than he'd imagined. A single examination room, a small office, and a supply closet that smelled of mildew and rust. The equipment was archaic. He spent the first day trying to bring some semblance of order to the place. As dusk fell, he saw the women. They began to drift from their houses, one by one, down to the water's edge. They were all ages, from girls barely out of their teens to weathered matriarchs. They didn't speak. They just stood on the wet, dark sand, letting the cold Atlantic foam wash over their bare feet. They stared out at the grey, featureless expanse of water. Ben watched them from his window, a strange knot tightening in his stomach. They weren't mourning. It wasn't a vigil, it was something else. A communion. A silent, nightly appointment with the ocean. He tried to introduce himself around the village over the next few days. The women were polite but distant. Their eyes held a strange serenity, a placid emptiness that he found more disturbing than open hostility. He paid a visit to a young woman named Ava. Her husband, a fisherman named Mark, had been lost to the sea a few months ago. Ben expected to find a grieving widow. Instead, he found a woman of quiet, unsettling calm. Her small house was neat, and she moved with a slow, deliberate grace. It was his time, she said, her gaze fixed on the gray water outside her window. The sea called him home. There was no sadness in her voice, only acceptance. A few nights later, a panicked knock came at his door. It was one of the older women. "It's Sarah. The baby's coming." Ben grabbed his medical bag. This was what he was here for. He rushed to a small shack on the edge of the village. He was met at the door by Silas and an ancient, wrinkled midwife named Martha. "This is the village's business, doctor," Silas said, his voice flat. His body blocked the doorway. "The sea will provide." "She's my patient," Ben insisted, trying to push past. Silas didn't move. He was deceptively strong for his age. "Go back to the clinic. Your medicine has no place here." Ben was forced to stand outside, listening. He heard Sarah's pained cries, then the guttural chanting of the midwife. And then he heard the baby's first cry. It wasn't the high-pitched wail of a human infant. It was a low, guttural, wet sound, a clicking, croaking noise that sounded more amphibian than mammalian. It made the hair on Ben's arms stand up. The next morning, he went to check on Sarah and the baby. Martha met him at the door. "The child was too weak," she said, her face a mask of sorrow. "The sea has taken it back." Ben asked to see the body, to sign the death certificate. He was refused. There would be no funeral, no record. It was as if the baby had never existed. The phantom cry of the newborn haunted Ben. He couldn't shake the sound. It was wrong. It was unnatural. He began to dig. He spent his nights in the dusty clinic office, poring over the old records. They were a mess of water-stained paper and faded ink, but a pattern began to emerge. The records of births were almost non-existent, but the death certificates told a story. The mortality rate for men between the ages of 20 and 40 was astronomical. The cause of death was always the same: lost at sea, drowning, boating accident. It was a statistical impossibility. The village should have died out generations ago, yet it persisted. It even seemed to prosper in its own bleak way. He noticed the fish. The villagers' hauls were always bountiful, even when fishermen from neighboring towns complained of empty nets. Ben bought some fish from the daily market on the jetty. It was a cod, but it was bigger than any he'd ever seen. Its eyes were a little too large. Its skin had a strange iridescent sheen. It tasted fine, but left a faint metallic aftertaste in his mouth. He started watching Ava, the young widow. She was pregnant. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Her husband had been dead for months. The village was too small, too insular for a secret affair. The child couldn't be Mark's. So who was the father? The question gnawed at him. He began to spend more time with her, under the guise of prenatal checkups. She was reluctant at first, but his gentle persistence wore her down. He saw the fear in her eyes, hidden deep beneath the placid surface. She was a victim, not a participant. One evening, as a storm was rolling in, he found his opportunity. Silas and the few able-bodied old men had taken their boats out, a strange ritual they performed before every major storm, a gift of appeasement, they called it. The village was nearly empty. Ben went to Sarah's house, the woman whose baby had died. He needed to know. He had to see. He slipped in through the unlocked back door. The house was dark and smelled powerfully of salt and brine. He moved through the small living area and into the bedroom. He found the child. It wasn't dead. It wasn't in a crib. It was in a large wooden washtub filled with seawater. Ben stared, his scientific mind refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing. The infant floated just below the surface. Its skin was pale and translucent, revealing a network of dark veins. Its fingers and toes were long and connected by thin, delicate webbing. Its eyes were huge, solid black orbs, unblinking and ancient. And on either side of its neck, where a human child would have ears, were two small, feathered slits. Gills. They pulsed gently, rhythmically, drawing oxygen from the water. It was alive. It was breathing. It turned its oversized head towards him, its lipless mouth opening to emit that same low, clicking croak. It was a creature of the deep being raised in a shack on land. Suddenly, Sarah was there. She stood in the doorway, her face a mask of terror. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She just looked at him, her eyes pleading. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Go. He'll know." He knows everything. Ben backed away, stumbling out of the house and into the growing storm. He ran back to the clinic. The image of the gilled infant burned into his brain. He knew now. They weren't losing their children. They were raising them, and they were not human. The storm that night was a reflection of the tempest in Ben's soul. Wind howled, rattling the clinic's windows. Rain lashed down in blinding sheets. He knew he had to get proof, something tangible, something he could take to the authorities on the mainland. The answer, he felt, had to be with Silas. The old man was the heart of this village, the high priest of this terrible cult. He pulled on his raincoat and slipped out into the storm. Silas's shack was set apart from the others, perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking the churning sea. It was more of a fortress than a home. Ben circled it, the wind trying to tear him from the slick rocks. He found a small, grimy window at the back and peered inside. The interior was not a home. It was a temple, a museum of horrors. The walls were not wood, they were covered in stretched, tanned hides. Ben felt sick as he realized it was human skin decorated with crude, painted symbols. The paintings depicted a nightmarish history. He saw images of a colossal entity rising from the sea, a being vaguely shaped like a woman, but formed of swirling currents, seaweed, and the bioluminescent creatures of the abyss. The Great Mother, the painting seemed to call her. He saw images of the village men, their faces not in terror but in ecstatic surrender, rowing out to meet her, to be enfolded in her watery embrace. He saw the Great Mother visiting the widows in their sleep, her form made of moonlight and sea foam. He saw the birth of the guild children, and he saw them being returned to the sea once they were old enough, rejoining their terrible parent. On a shelf, there was a row of glass jars. They contained specimens preserved in a murky yellow fluid. Abominations, the failed experiments of this unholy breeding program, fetuses with tentacles instead of arms, infants with cyclopean eyes. It was a gallery of evolutionary dead ends. "She is a lonely god, Doctor." Silas's voice came from directly behind him. Ben spun around, his heart stopping. The old man stood in the pouring rain, unfazed by the storm. His dark eyes were fixed on Ben. He wasn't angry, he seemed resigned. He led Ben inside the shack. The smell of brine and old blood was overwhelming. "Our ancestors made a pact," Silas said, his voice a low monotone against the roar of the storm. "The village was starving. The sea was barren, they prayed, and she answered." He gestured to the hideous paintings. "She craves children, companionship. We give her our strongest men, our husbands, our sons. They become her consorts. In return, she gives us her bounty, and she entrusts us with her young." He looked at Ben, his eyes devoid of any emotion. "We are her nursery, her cradle. We raise her offspring until they are strong enough to hear her call and return to her. It is a holy arrangement. A covenant that has kept this village alive for centuries." Ben stared at him, horrified. This wasn't madness. It was an ancient functioning system, a biological and theological contract. "My role," Silas continued, "is to be the shepherd, to ensure the covenant is honored, to deliver the children home when their time comes." As if on cue, the storm outside seemed to lessen. Silas walked to the door. "Come, the sea is calm after a gift. It's time for a delivery." Two old fishermen appeared out of the darkness, holding Ben by the arms. They dragged him out of the shack and along the cliff path. Down on the beach, Martha the midwife was waiting, holding Sarah's guild child. It was bigger now, its limbs longer, its skin shimmering in the moonlight that broke through the clouds. Silas took the creature from her. It did not struggle. It seemed to recognize him. He carried it to a small dory and pushed off into the now eerily calm water. The fisherman held Ben fast, forcing him to watch. Silas rowed to the center of the bay. He began to sing. A strange ululating lullaby that seemed to make the water vibrate. The surface of the bay began to glow. A pale phosphorescent light rose from the depths. Something immense and ancient was stirring. A shape began to form. It was not solid. It was a swirling mass of light and water. Countless tentacles of soft glowing flesh and huge dark intelligent eyes that floated within the vortex. It was beautiful and it was terrifying. The Great Mother had come for her child. She gently took the infant from Silas's arms with a single loving tendril and drew it down into her watery body. The light faded. The sea was still. The covenant had been fulfilled. Ben was no longer a doctor. He was a prisoner. He was the next offering. He knew it with a chilling certainty. A healthy male, an outsider, fresh blood for the Great Mother. He tried to escape. He made a run for the muddy track out of the village, but a landslide, conveniently timed, had blocked the path completely. The fishing boats in the harbor all had their engines sabotaged. He was trapped. The villagers' demeanor towards him changed. He was no longer the outsider doctor. He was a holy object, a sacrifice in waiting. They brought him food. The best food. Strange, succulent fish he'd never seen before, oysters the size of his fist. The food was seasoned with a special spice, a dark green powder made from a specific seaweed that only grew in the deepest parts of the bay. Ava was assigned to him. She brought him his meals, her eyes downcast, filled with a mixture of pity and duty. She was to be his designated widow. The food began to change him, a subtle, creeping transformation. His skin always felt damp no matter how much he dried it. He began to crave salt. His dreams became vivid, watery nightmares. Or were they dreams? He dreamt he was sinking into a cold, dark, silent abyss. But there was no fear. He felt a vast, cold embrace. The arms of a colossal woman made of seawater and starlight held him. He felt a peace more profound than any he had ever known. When he woke, his body was covered in a thin, slimy film that smelled of the ocean. They weren't just fattening him for the slaughter, they were preparing him, marinating him, changing his very biology to make him a more suitable consort for their terrible god. He fought it. He tried not to eat the food, but the hunger was overwhelming. The cravings were a physical pain. The dreams became more seductive. He saw her face in the depths, a face of impossible ancient beauty. He felt her longing, her immense cosmic loneliness. A part of him, a part he was terrified of, began to want to go to her. He was losing himself. The man, the doctor, the scientist, was being washed away by a tide of primal instinct and biological imperative. He was becoming a creature of the sea. The night of the full moon was the night of the wedding. They came for him at high tide, Silas and the widows. They were dressed in ceremonial robes woven from seaweed and fishing nets. They led him down to the beach. He didn't fight. The will to resist was gone, drowned in a sea of narcotic food and hypnotic dreams. He walked as if in a trance. Ava stood on the sand, tears streaming down her face. She was the only one left with any humanity. In a final desperate act of rebellion, she lunged forward, pushing Ben away from the water towards the dark tree line at the edge of the beach. "Run!" she screamed, her voice raw with anguish. "Run, Ben!" The other widows seized her, their placid expressions for once replaced by cold fury. They dragged her towards the waves. Silas looked at her, his face filled not with anger but with a deep, chilling disappointment. "The Great Mother does not appreciate a spoiled gift," he said calmly, "but she will accept a replacement. They would offer her instead." Ben ran. He crashed through the tangled undergrowth of the coastal forest, the sounds of the ceremony fading behind him. He ran without stopping, fueled by a terror that had finally broken through the chemical haze. He survived for days on nothing, a ragged, haunted specter in the woods, until a park ranger found him, dehydrated and delirious. Months later, Ben was back in the city. He was a ghost. He worked a desk job at the health department, a shadow of the man he once was. The nightmares never stopped. Every night, he drowned in the cold embrace of the sea. One day, a small package arrived at his office. There was no return address. The postmark was from a small town a few miles up the coast from Petty Harbor. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of damp seaweed, was a single object, a large black pearl, its surface swirling with an unnatural, oily luminescence. It was the most beautiful and terrifying thing he had ever seen. Tucked beneath it was a small, folded piece of paper. The handwriting was Silas's. It contained only a single chilling sentence. "The Great Mother was pleased with your gift. She has accepted. Thank you for our child." Ben dropped the pearl. It rolled across his desk, leaving a faint, slimy trail. He stared at it, the final, horrifying truth crashing down on him. The food, the dreams, the transformation. It hadn't been to prepare him for death. It had been a harvesting. He hadn't been the sacrifice. He had been the sire. The covenant had been fulfilled, not with his death, but with his seed. The horror wasn't trapped in Pity Harbor. A part of him was now down there, in the cold, dark deep, growing inside a lonely, ancient god. He would never be free. He was a husband to the sea, a widower on the land, forever.